Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 115 called Arabs and Visigoths. So we're starting the final season in this podcast, which is on the Dark Ages. But just how dark were they? One of the main themes of this new season will be to show the striking diversity of experience within Western Eurasia and North Africa during the period from AD 700 to 1000, since while the Dark Ages were, in my view, very dark for most of Europe, outside Europe in the Middle East and North Africa, the period after the fall of the Roman Empire wasn't necessarily that dark. The Dark Ages has become a Euro-centric term for the collapse of Roman civilization in Europe. But of course, one of the key things about the Roman Empire was it wasn't just European. We must remember that Rome was essentially a Mediterranean empire which extended into three continents: Europe, Asia and Africa. And in Asia and Africa, the period that we in Europe call the Dark Ages was far from dark, especially if you were a Muslim, since the Islamic caliphates, the Umayyad and then the Abbasid, continued the astonishing rise of Islam after the death of Muhammad. In episode 113, we heard how, at the eastern end of Europe, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III defeated a huge Arab army at the gates of Constantinople in the cold winter of 717 to 718. This was a turning point in history since it marked the first major setback for the Arabs. But what about the West? And that's where I want to turn in this and the next few episodes, because pretty much at the same time the Arabs launched their great offensive against Constantinople, they were also expanding rapidly into Spain and even France. And the springboard for their invasion of Western Europe was, of course, one of their most successful and far-reaching conquests of all, that of North Africa. Now, as you know, this began with the Romans' loss of Egypt to the Arabs in 642, which we covered in episode 111. After that, the spread of Islam from Egypt across North Africa was surprisingly slow. It wasn't until 698 that the Arab general Hassan took the city of Carthage, the last Roman possession in North Africa. Unlike the lenient treatment offered to most Roman cities in the Levant and Egypt, which continued largely undisturbed under Arab rule, Hassan razed Carthage to the ground. One of the greatest cities from the ancient world was obliterated, although its grand remains are still visible today. I think historians sometimes lose sight of the significance of the loss of North Africa to the Arabs in terms of the profound reconfiguration of both politics and culture in this new post-Roman world that dawned in the 8th century AD. Egypt and North Africa had been integral parts of the Hellenistic culture of the Roman Empire for centuries before the Arab conquests, and significantly wealthier and more important contributors to the Roman treasury than Gaul and Britain had ever been. Although the Vandal conquest of Carthage had been a major disruption for Roman control of the Mediterranean, nevertheless, the Vandals preserved Roman culture and continued to trade with Italy and Constantinople, much as had been done for centuries before. But the real turning point in the history of the Mediterranean, in my view, was the Islamic conquest of North Africa, which separated it both culturally and economically from the northern Mediterranean. It was the great French historian Henri Pirenne who argued in his seminal work Mohammed and Charlemagne that it was this division which brought the ancient world to an end and heralded the new world, which to some extent still exists today. It's a view I totally agree with. This divide was, of course, confirmed with the fall of Carthage in 698, as I mentioned, which directly facilitated the Arab invasion of Spain in 711, which is the subject of today's episode. So let's get on with it. The key point is that the Arab victory in Spain and Portugal, called Al-Andalus by the Arabs, was remarkably swift, with most of the peninsula coming under their control within only 6 years by 716. Now, this was surprising because the Arabs faced the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, which was supposedly one of the most successful successor states to the Roman Empire in Western Europe. As evidence of this, historians point to its political unity. Unlike the confusing mishmash of little kingdoms that existed in Frankish Gaul and Anglo-Saxon England, the Visigoths seem to have established a single united state with its capital at Toledo. In addition, the Visigothic Church was a strong institution, championed initially by the famous Isidore of Seville, who lived between 560 to 636, a Hispano-Roman theologian and Archbishop of Seville, who helped convert the Arian Visigoths to Catholicism and wrote an influential encyclopedia compiling ancient texts. Finally, the Visigothic Code was a legal code unique in the barbarian West, similar in intent to Justinian's Great Code, if not quite reaching its level of sophistication. However, Visigothic civilization, apparently so superior to that of Frankish Gaul and Anglo-Saxon England, had another side to it. By AD 700, the Visigoths in Spain seem to have been absorbed into the local population to the extent that a separate Visigothic identity had all but disappeared, even though we refer to them as Visigoths. This differed greatly from Gaul and England, where the Germanic immigrants constituted a dominant ruling class and maintained a military tradition handed down over centuries from their pre-Roman roots. However, this distinction seems to have been eroded in Spain, especially after intermarriage between Visigoths and native Hispano-Romans was permitted in around 575. The Visigoths had probably never numbered more than around 100,000, whereas the native Spanish population numbered millions. With intermarriage came dilution of Visigothic identity. By AD 700, there's no mention of a separate Gothic language in any ecclesiastical or legal texts. Latin seems to have recovered its linguistic dominance. Particularly revealing is the Visigothic Code, as I mentioned, compiled in the 8th century, which stopped referring to Goths altogether, who we know previously enjoyed special legal advantages over the natives. And well before AD 700, the inhabitants of what we call Visigothic Spain thought of themselves as Hispano-Romans, not Visigoths. Nevertheless, historians continue to refer to this new state as Visigothic, and for sake of simplicity, I will do the same. Now, the $6 million question is, why did this Hispano-Visigothic state collapse so easily? Many historians have ascribed it to decadence. This conjures up a rather dubious image of the Visigoths lounging around in 7th century equivalents of wine bars and casinos, rather than applying themselves to proper jobs. Edward Gibbon went so far as to call them effeminate, although I don't think this translates very well. What I think he was referring to was their military prowess, i.e. their commitment to warfare. And I think on this point, Gibbon was on something, although I wouldn't use the term effeminate. Instead, what I suggest he meant was a structural decline of the Visigothic army, as they placed less emphasis on the warrior culture that had been so conspicuous with the Germanic tribes when they invaded the Roman Empire back in the 5th century. Our problem is that we have almost no information on the size and features of the Visigothic army in AD 711 when it faced the Arab invasion. In contrast, we know quite a lot about the armies of the other barbarian kingdoms in the remains of the Western Roman Empire. For example, in Ostrogothic Italy, in the 6th century, Procopius tells us that only Ostrogoths could train and fight as soldiers, and that native Italian men were forbidden to carry arms except for hunting. As for the army's structure, we know it consisted of the Ostrogothic king's central field army, supplemented by levies on the nobles. In contrast, we have absolutely no idea what the Visigothic army was like in the early 8th century, but I conjecture it was probably still centralised. However, I suggest it was probably quite small, and smaller than its Frankish and Anglo-Saxon counterparts. The reason for this was political. With a century of relative peace in the 7th century, the Visigothic army just didn't need to be very big. Political unity in Spain meant it was not riven by the intense fighting that was waged between the small rival Frankish kingdoms before the Merovingian and Carolingian unification. I imagine that in Frankish Gaul, a large proportion of the male population spent their time fighting each other because they had to. In contrast, in Spain, a century of peace meant that a much smaller percentage of the male population was trained and experienced in warfare. Now, the price of this proved to be defeat on the battlefield. As Vigetius, the Roman soldier and chronicler, noted in the 5th century, if you want peace, prepare for war. And that's exactly what the Visigoths had not done. And if the Visigoths weren't preparing for war, the Arabs certainly were. There were very few Arabs in North Africa, but they had an almost inexhaustible supply of warlike warriors to draw on from the newly converted Berber tribes of North Africa. The Berbers weren't Arabs and had no ethnic link to them whatsoever. They traced their descent from purely African origins, and their languages were quite distinct from Arabic. The term Berber actually comes from the Romans, who called them barbarians or barbari, which passed into Arabic as barbar or Berber. Initially, the Berbers opposed the Arabs. It was the Arab general Hassan, who you remember took Carthage in 698, who also defeated and killed in the same year the Berber queen Kahina, who'd led a powerful resistance movement against the Arabs. Hassan had been entrusted with a formidable Arab army drawn from Arabia and the Levant. It was this which secured the Maghreb as the region of northwestern Africa, including modern Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco is called. The Arabs won over the Berber tribes by promising them plunder if they converted to Islam. Indeed, this was probably a major reason behind the invasion of Spain, since the prospect of looting the supposedly wealthy Visigothic cities in Spain was the glue necessary to attach the Berber tribes to Islam. Another more sinister aspect was the slave trade, especially in Berber women, who the Arabs discovered fetched high prices in the Levantine slave markets. Not surprisingly, this trade proved divisive among the Berbers, with many objecting to the exploitation of their people, but many others were happy to profit from it. It fueled the Great Berber Rebellion of 740, which nearly overthrew Arab control of the Maghreb and Spain, which we'll cover in a later episode. With this context now explained, the extraordinary set of events that unfolded from 711 to 716 will, I hope, make more sense. I say this because our source material for these vital years is woefully lacking. Aside from a brief and anonymous commentary, probably written by native Hispanic, the so-called Chronicle of 754, named after the year of the last entry, our sources are entirely written in Arabic, long after the events themselves, initially by the Egyptian chronicler Al-Hakam in the 9th century, and then in a more detailed version written in the 10th century, that's 200 years after the events, by a Persian chronicler named Razi. Both versions describe a sort of fairy tale with a wonderful Arab victory in which a small band of Berber warriors, devout converts to Islam, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and heroically defeated a vast Visigothic army numbering 100,000 beside the river Guadalete, killing the Visigothic king Rodrigo. The historian is then left with the unenviable task of trying to work out what really happened. My sense is that, similar to the accounts of the battles of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah against the Romans and Persians, written hundreds of years after the events, which also describe heroic Muslim victories against overwhelming odds, the numbers were probably the other way around. In episodes 107 and 108, I described my view that the Arab armies which defeated the Romans and Persians owed their success to numerical superiority, something which future Islamic chroniclers were both unaware of and unwilling to admit, since it would have belittled the stories of heroism which their narratives extolled. So I suggest it was the same with the decisive Battle of Guadalete in southern Spain in 711. My guess, although I can't prove it, is that a large army of Berber tribesmen, who were no doubt enthusiastic converts to Islam and attracted to the prospect of plunder from the cities of Visigothic Spain, triumphed over a smaller army of Hispano-Visigothic soldiers unused to fighting large battles. Although the Islamic accounts of the battle are unreliable, they do, however, provide some interesting insights. Most conspicuous is a legend about the disunity of the Visigothic army. The Arab account says that in 710 the Visigothic king Witiza died, leaving 4 sons, but, for reasons not explained, the throne was seized by a nobleman, Rodrigo. Consequently, Witiza's sons were motivated against Rodrigo. In addition, Islamic legend describes a mysterious figure known as Lord Julian, apparently the governor of Ceuta, a port on the African coastline close to Tangier, who, despite being Christian and possibly Byzantine, helped Tariq and his Berbers cross the Straits of Gibraltar, since he had a feud with Rodrigo, who'd made his daughter pregnant when Julian had sent her to Toledo for her education and introduction to the royal court. Interestingly, the most reliable account of these years, but extremely brief as I mentioned, the Latin Chronicle of 754, supports this view that the Visigoths were disunited, stating that the Visigothic army betrayed Rodrigo and caused the king to be defeated. Quote, "The entire army of the Goths fled, and he, i.e. Rodrigo, was killed," end quote. Whatever the true reasons for Visigothic defeat at Guadalete, the result was as catastrophic for the Visigoths as the battles of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah had been for the Romans and Persians. After the battle, the entire Visigothic kingdom simply caved in. Tariq's expeditionary force advanced on Cordoba and took the city which would become the future capital of Andalus. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, was next. Here, Islamic legend tells the story of the sealed room in the Visigothic palace, which had never been opened and was secured by dozens of locks. The tradition was that no Visigothic king was permitted to open the door, and that on his accession every king had to add another lock. However, it was Rodrigo, the unlawful usurper, defeated at Guadalete, who insisted on opening the door. Inside he found an inscription prophesying that the Arabs would destroy the Visigoths. Success attracts success. In the spring of 712, Tariq's Berber army was joined by an even larger army led by another Arab general, Musa. This was different from Tariq's army in that it was ethnically Arab. It emulated Tariq's success, advancing on towns in the south, Medina, Sidonia and Carmona, before taking Merida, which only fell after a protracted siege over the winter of 712 to 713. Merida had been one of the main cities of Roman Spain and still seems to have had a sizable population which had no wish to surrender to the Arabs. Nevertheless, it did fall, as did Zaragoza and in due course Barcelona, and after that the Arabs took the coastal route passed the Pyrenees and entered southern Gaul, which was in Visigothic hands, and where the first town to fall was Narbonne in 719. We'll cover the story of the Arab invasion of Gaul in the next episode, and I want to finish this one by completing the story of the Arab conquest of Spain by looking at two more significant points. First, what sort of government did the Arabs implement in Spain? The question's always puzzled historians, but it seems likely the majority of the Christian population was allowed to continue their lives undisturbed, provided they acknowledged Arab rule. This was entirely consistent with the Arab policy in the Levant and Egypt, and simply seems to have been copied in Spain. It was a highly successful formula, since it didn't antagonize the indigenous populations and allowed the Arabs to rule a centralized state with minimal bureaucracy. As such, it had very strong similarities with the Roman Empire, a subject we'll come back to in future episodes. We have few surviving documents that detail the sort of arrangements the Arab conquerors put in place with the conquered Hispanic population, but one such is a treaty made in 713 between the Visigothic noble Theodomir, living in Murcia in southeast Spain, and the Arab governor of the region, Abdelaziz. This stipulates that in return for paying 1 dinar per man, plus a stipulated amount of wheat, barley, fruit juice, vinegar, honey, and olive oil, the Visigothic lord would be left completely at peace to practice his religion and to govern his land entirely as he wanted. The fact that Theodomir was willing to agree to this indicates a good level of pragmatism on his part, perhaps based, some historians believe, on his hope that Arab rule would only be transitory. Had he been told it would continue for the next 500 years, he might have had different ideas. Who knows? Second, before we leave Spain to move to the land of the Franks, we need to mention that, as the writers Goscinny and Uderzo said of the Roman conquest of Gaul in the famous Asterix books, quote, "All of Gaul is occupied by the Romans. Well, not entirely. One small village still held out," end quote. So it was with the Arab conquest of Iberia. One small part of the Iberian Peninsula held out, and it was to prove very significant. This was in the mountainous region called the Picos de Europa in northwestern Spain, where, according to the legend that was established in around AD 900, called the Chronicle of Alfonso III, a heroic Visigothic nobleman, Pelayo, swam across a river with his horse to escape the Arabs and founded a resistance movement in a cave. The climate and environment of the Picos de Europa is different from that of the rest of Spain, with plenty of rainfall and well-watered forests and rivers. It's also rugged, with steep gorges and rocky outcrops, ideal for a resistance movement to hide and ambush its enemies. The legend is like that of the English Robin Hood, in which he and his outlaws lived in the vast forest of Sherwood. Although another English legend, that of King Arthur and his knights, is actually more contemporaneous. Pelayo's independence movement soon attracted the attention of the Arabs, who sent, according to the Chronicle, a vast army of over 100,000, clearly an absurd exaggeration, against the defiant Christians. A legendary battle took place at Covadonga, usually dated to 717, in which the Arab army was apparently utterly routed with enormous casualties. I very much doubt the accuracy of any of this, and I suspect the famous battle was nothing more than a skirmish in which a band of Berbers and Arabs was ambushed by the Spanish. But nevertheless, it marked the birth of a new legend and the beginning of the Spanish fight back against the Arabs, called the Reconquista, the end of which is officially dated to 1492 when the Arab kingdom of Granada finally fell, meaning it took 775 years for the Spanish to reclaim Spain from the Arabs, even longer than most estimates of the life of the Roman Empire. In future episodes, we'll continue with the extraordinary story of Arab Spain, especially as it rose to become an independent Muslim state called the Caliphate of Cordoba, when it would emerge as one of the brightest beacons of the Islamic Golden Age, with Cordoba overtaking Constantinople in size and splendour. But before we do that, we need to continue our story of the Muslim advance into the heartland of Western Europe, for their armies were now striking into Gaul, and the prospect of their adding Western Europe to their already vast domains must have seemed very real. If they'd succeeded, as Edward Gibbon famously but rather bizarrely said, quote, "Perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford," end quote. But, as we'll hear, the Arabs would meet an opponent altogether more formidable than the Visigoths, and that was, of course, the Franks. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the start to this new season, where we've departed from the history of the late Roman Empire to venture into the extraordinary world of the Dark Ages. The next episode will be on the Franks in 2 weeks' time, on the 2nd of August, and if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.